Before we continue the story, I just want to share something from my heart. Writing these stories has become more than just a hobby for me. It's something I truly enjoy and spend a lot of time creating for you all. Recently, I was looking through my channel analytics, and I noticed that many people who watch my videos don't usually leave a like or comment. I've never really been the type to ask for it, but the truth is, every like, comment, and subscribe helps these stories reach more people. It tells YouTube that this video is worth sharing, and that support genuinely helps this channel grow. So if you're enjoying the story so far, I'd really appreciate it if you take a second to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe. Your support means more than you know, and it helps me continue bringing more stories like this to life. Now, let's continue the story. The day I played that recording, I watched my in-laws' faces go completely white. They had spent months building a legal case to take my house from me. They had lawyers. They had documents. They had 12 years of making me feel like I never truly belonged. What they didn't have was the conversation I secretly recorded 6 months before my husband died. The conversation where they planned everything. But to understand why that moment destroyed them completely, you need to understand what it feels like to spend 12 years trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided, before you ever arrived, that you didn't belong. My name is Rebecca Lawson. I'm 38 years old. And by the time my husband Daniel died, I had spent over a decade learning how powerful, wealthy people can smile warmly at your face while quietly building the exit they planned for you all along. The first time his family tried to take my house, they did it 3 weeks after his funeral. The second time, they came with lawyers. The third time, they sat across from me in a mediation room wearing expensive suits and confident smiles, absolutely certain they had already won. They were wrong about that. When the process server knocked on my front door, I was still wearing one of Daniel's old sweatshirts. I remember that detail because it still smelled faintly like him. Coffee, cedar cologne, laundry detergent. Grief makes you notice the strangest things when everything familiar starts disappearing. The man standing outside looked uncomfortable the moment I answered. "Rebecca Lawson," he asked carefully. I nodded. "I'm sorry," he muttered, handing me a thick envelope before stepping back like he genuinely didn't want to watch what happened next. The second I saw the law firm's name on the return address, my stomach tightened. Not because I recognized the firm. Because I recognized the last name printed underneath it. Lawson. My late husband's family. I opened the envelope right there in the doorway. My hands were already shaking before I reached the third line. Petition for property claim. They were suing me for my own house. The house Daniel and I lived in for 9 years. The house I helped save when his business nearly collapsed. The house where I sat beside him through chemotherapy treatments and held his hand at 2 in the morning while he cried because he was terrified he wouldn't survive long enough to see summer. That house. According to the lawsuit, the property belonged to the Lawson bloodline, and I was occupying it under temporary marital privilege. I actually laughed reading that. Not because it was funny. Because it was so deliberately cruel that it almost sounded fictional. My phone rang while I was still standing at the door. Vanessa Lawson, my mother-in-law. I stared at her name on the screen for a full 5 seconds. "Rebecca," she said calmly when I answered, like she was discussing the weather. "I assume you received the paperwork." "You sued me," I whispered. Her sigh carried irritation, not guilt, not even a trace of it. "That house was never truly yours." Something sharp twisted hard inside my chest. "Daniel and I bought this house together." "No," she corrected, coldly and carefully. "Daniel bought it. The Lawson family protected it. And now that Daniel is gone, things need to return where they belong." I gripped the kitchen counter to steady myself. "I'm still your son's wife." A pause. Then the sentence I will probably remember for the rest of my life. "You were only supposed to be there while Daniel was alive." Silence, heavy, suffocating. Then she added quietly, You don't carry the Lawson name anymore. And just like that, 12 years of trying to be accepted collapsed into one horrifying truth. To them, I had never been family. I had always been temporary. After she hung up, I stood alone in my kitchen staring at the lawsuit while grief and rage fought each other inside my chest. Then something surfaced, suddenly from the back of my memory. A dinner. 6 months earlier. A conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. A conversation so disturbing that I secretly recorded it on my phone because something deep in my gut suddenly felt genuinely unsafe. At the time, I convinced myself I was overreacting. By the time Daniel died, I had completely forgotten the recording existed. But standing there holding those papers, it came back in perfect, terrible clarity. And for the first time since Daniel's death, I realized something that made my blood run cold. His family hadn't started planning this after he died. They had been planning it while he was still alive. I met Daniel Lawson when I was 26, working as an event coordinator for a charity fundraiser downtown. He walked into the ballroom late wearing a navy suit and apologizing to literally everyone in sight because he genuinely hated making entrances. That was Daniel, gentle even when nobody expected him to be. We came from completely different worlds. I grew up in a small apartment with a single mother who worked double shifts at a grocery store. Daniel grew up in old money Connecticut wealth, where people inherited lake houses and debated private schools over Sunday brunch. The first time I met his mother, she looked at my dress for 3 full seconds before asking Daniel, "Is she one of the staff?" I wish I were exaggerating. Daniel laughed awkwardly and corrected her immediately, but the damage stayed. It always stayed. Things were never openly hostile after that, which would have almost been easier. Instead, it stayed subtle. Quiet cuts disguised carefully as manners. Vanessa casually asking if I felt comfortable at certain restaurants. Graham explaining basic investment concepts to me like I was a child who needed patience. Family conversations that stopped the moment I entered a room. I kept trying anyway. Because I loved Daniel. And because Daniel loved me fiercely enough that I convinced myself eventually his family would too. I was wrong about that for 12 years straight. Then, 3 years into our marriage, Daniel's business hit serious trouble. People assume wealthy families automatically support each other during hard times. Not the Lawsons. Vanessa believed struggle built character. Translation: she watched her son nearly lose everything and refused to help. I was the one who emptied my savings account to cover mortgage payments during the worst months. I was the one working extra freelance contracts until midnight while Daniel fought to stabilize the company. I sat on the floor surrounded by unpaid bills while the man I loved looked absolutely broken beside me. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I grabbed his face and said, "We save this together." And we did. That house became more than property after that moment. It became proof that we could survive anything difficult together. Daniel never forgot what I sacrificed for it. Toward the end of his illness, after the second round of treatments failed, and we both understood what the silence between his doctors actually meant, he started talking differently about the future. One night he sat beside me staring at the fireplace for a long time before saying quietly, "If anything happens to me, this house is yours." I told him immediately not to speak like that. But he repeated it anyway, looking directly at me. "Rebecca, listen to me. I already updated everything legally. Nobody can take this place from you." At the time, I thought he meant emotionally. I didn't realize he meant it as a legal warning. And I didn't realize his family already had plans that directly contradicted everything he just promised me. If you've ever felt like someone tolerated your presence instead of genuinely accepting it, you already understand part of what I'm about to describe. And if you've ever watched grief reveal the true nature of people you thought you knew, really watched it happen in real time, then you understand how disorienting it feels when the people who should protect you suddenly become the threat. because the first warning signs started before Daniel's funeral flowers even wilted. Vanessa's focus after his death wasn't emotional. It wasn't about memories or grief or how I was surviving. It was about paperwork, insurance documents, mortgage files, property records. 3 days after the funeral, she stood in my kitchen holding a coffee mug and casually asked, "Daniel kept the deed under the family trust, correct?" I blinked at her. "I don't know." Her expression tightened for exactly 1 second before smoothing back into polite concern. "You should find out." Then Graham started appearing unannounced, always framed as support. "You shouldn't handle all this stress alone," he'd say, while walking through rooms and looking around just slightly too carefully to be casual. One afternoon, he stood in my dining room and asked, "Have you considered downsizing?" I stared at him. "My husband died 2 weeks ago." "I'm being practical," he said simply. No, he was being strategic. I just didn't understand that yet. Then the rumors started. Slowly at first, mutual friends acting strangely distant, a woman at the grocery store awkwardly asking whether I was holding up okay financially. I discovered later that Vanessa had been quietly telling people Daniel had worried about my spending habits before he died. Which was a breathtaking lie, considering I spent years financially holding their son's entire life together. Then came the lawsuit. And the worst part wasn't the filing itself. It was what was buried inside it. Specific private conversations referenced in detail. Financial figures only discussed in closed family meetings. Information that had absolutely no business being inside legal paperwork unless someone had been collecting it deliberately for a long time. That's when the terrible realization fully landed. They weren't reacting emotionally to Daniel's death. They had been quietly, methodically preparing for it. I hired an attorney 2 days later, once panic finally gave way to something harder. That's when I met Evelyn Carter. Sharp eyes, silver hair pulled back cleanly, a voice that stayed completely level regardless of what she was hearing. She shook my hand once and asked immediately, "What aren't they telling you?" Not what happened, not how are you feeling. What aren't they telling you? I liked her instantly. She reviewed the lawsuit quietly, reading every page without interrupting herself. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair slowly. "This filing is aggressive," she admitted. "Do you think they can win?" "No." A pause. "But I think they fully expected you to surrender before it ever reached this point." That sentence stayed in my head all night. Because she was right. The entire lawsuit was emotionally engineered to exhaust me into quitting. And it almost worked. Legal fees started draining my savings fast. Friends quietly disappeared. One couple stopped inviting me to gatherings entirely after Graham told their social circle I was attempting to seize Lawson family assets. Seize? Like I was a stranger invading a home I had lived in for nearly a decade. Then one evening, everything changed in a parking lot. I was driving home from Evelyn's office when I passed a furniture showroom downtown. Through the front glass, I saw Vanessa, with Graham, standing over an open blueprint on a display table, talking and laughing while a salesperson pointed at something on the page. I almost kept driving. Then I looked closer at the blueprint, and my stomach dropped completely. I recognized my kitchen layout, my living room configuration, the hallway dimensions I had memorized from 9 years of living inside them. My home. They were redesigning my home before I had left it. I parked across the street, hands shaking, and watched Graham point at something while Vanessa smiled and said clearly enough that I could read her lips through the glass. "We'll finally modernize the place once she's gone." Gone. Like I was an inconvenience, a scheduling problem between them and real estate. I sat in that parking lot for a long time before I remembered the recording. 6 months before Daniel died, the Lawsons hosted a private family dinner following one of his medical appointments. Daniel went asleep upstairs early that evening because treatment had exhausted him completely. I came downstairs later looking for tea. That's when I heard voices coming from the partially closed study door. Vanessa, Graham's wife Elise. But it wasn't the voices that stopped me. It was the tone. Cold, measured, deliberate. I froze completely outside the door, and I heard Vanessa say quietly, "Once Daniel's gone, the house situation becomes significantly easier." My heart slammed against my ribs, so hard I felt it in my throat. Then Graham laughed softly. "She won't know how to fight this legally." Something primal shifted inside me right there in that hallway. Not panic. Instinct. I pulled out my phone silently and pressed record. I told myself afterward it was paranoid, irrational, that I had misunderstood the context, but something wouldn't let me delete it. 10 minutes of audio. 10 minutes I buried in a cloud backup and forgot about completely, until the night I stood in my kitchen holding lawsuit papers. I dug through old backups until 2 a.m, until my hands finally found the file. When I pressed play and heard Vanessa's voice fill the room, I had to sit down. Daniel never needed to know how the trust was structured. Rebecca's emotional. Emotional people fold under sustained pressure. Then Elise laughing softly, especially once they're properly isolated. Then Vanessa again, calm as someone discussing a renovation timeline. Once she's out of the house, we liquidate quickly before property values shift. They weren't grieving possibilities. They were scheduling outcomes. Months before my husband took his last breath. The next morning, I brought the recording directly to Evelyn. She listened without interrupting once. When it ended, she removed her glasses very slowly and set them on the desk. "Rebecca," she said carefully, "if this recording holds up legally, their entire case may collapse." I stared at her. "How?" "Because this stops being a property dispute and starts looking like coordinated, premeditated bad faith manipulation of a grieving widow." For the first time since Daniel died, I felt something dangerous return inside my chest. Control. But the recording created a brutal emotional problem I hadn't anticipated. Playing it publicly would permanently destroy any remaining connection to Daniel's family. And some part of me, a part I'm not proud of but won't pretend didn't exist, still struggled with that. Not because they deserved protection. Because I loved Daniel, and exposing his family felt strangely, painfully connected to exposing part of him too. Evelyn understood before I finished the sentence. "You're still protecting his memory," she said quietly. "I don't want his legacy reduced to this ugliness." "It won't be," she replied. "But Rebecca, protecting people who are actively destroying you isn't loyalty anymore. It's just pain with better manners." That hit somewhere deep and didn't leave. Meanwhile, Vanessa escalated. She invited me to lunch 3 days later at a private country club where everyone knew her by name. A power move so deliberate it was almost impressive. The moment we sat down, she slid an envelope across the white tablecloth. Inside was a financial offer. A payoff. "If you leave quietly," she said with remarkable calm, "this can end respectfully for everyone." The number wasn't enough to buy a small apartment in this city, let alone replace 9 years of a home. "You're offering me money to surrender my own house." "I'm offering you dignity," she replied. I laughed before I could stop myself. That irritated her more than anger would have. "Rebecca, dragging this through court becomes very ugly." "You already made it ugly, months before Daniel died." Her composure fractured for exactly 1 second. Just one. The mask slipped, and underneath it was something cold and calculating that had been there all along. "You never understood this family," she said. "No," I replied quietly. "I understood it perfectly. I just kept hopping I was wrong." I stood up to leave. Before I walked away, I turned back and asked her one question I'd been holding for months. "When exactly did you start planning this?" For 1 second, just one, she looked genuinely startled. And that reaction told me everything her answer never would. Mediation was scheduled 3 weeks later. The nights leading up to it were the hardest part of this entire story. Not because I doubted the evidence, but because I knew exactly what playing that recording would do to whatever remained between me and Daniel's world. I listened to it repeatedly to prepare myself emotionally. Each pass revealed new cruelty I'd missed before. Elise casually joking about redecorating the upstairs bedroom before Daniel had even been declared terminal. Graham saying with complete confidence, once she's emotionally exhausted enough, she'll sign literally anything. They had studied me like a problem to be managed, not a grieving wife, a variable to be neutralized. Evelyn spent those weeks building airtight timelines, ownership records, and trust document analyses. One evening, while organizing files, she looked up at me and said quietly, "People reveal everything about themselves when they believe nobody's documenting them." I looked at the recorder on the desk. "Truth sounds completely different," she added, "when it's played back out loud." The night before mediation, I didn't sleep. Not because I feared losing. Because I was about to watch Daniel's family destroy themselves in public. And some small, stubborn part of me still mourned that. The mediation center was a polished conference space downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Clean, neutral, expensive-looking in a deliberate way. When I arrived, the Lawsons were already seated. Relaxed, confident, Graham actually smiled when he saw me enter. That smile disappeared the moment Evelyn walked in behind me carrying 4 organized binders and setting them down on the table with quiet, deliberate precision. Then I noticed what was sitting beside Vanessa's chair. Transfer paperwork, already prepared, already signed on their end. They had come to collect, not negotiate. They already believe the house is theirs, I whispered to Evelyn while we settled. She adjusted her glasses without looking up. Overconfidence makes careful people careless. Their attorney opened aggressively. Within 10 minutes, I had been characterized as emotionally unstable, financially reckless, grief-stricken to the point of irrationality, and someone who had leveraged Daniel's illness for personal financial security. Vanessa sat beside him nodding with practiced sadness. A grieving mother forced to clean up the chaos left behind by a manipulative outsider. It was a flawless performance. Then their attorney leaned forward with complete confidence and delivered the line they had clearly rehearsed. "This house belongs to the Lawson family legacy." Graham added quietly, "Mrs. Lawson simply overstayed her role." Overstayed her role. Like my 9-year marriage, was a temporary position with a performance review. Evelyn stayed completely still beside me, which unsettled them more than any emotional reaction would have. After nearly an hour of accusations, financial demands, and meticulously rehearsed cruelty, the mediator finally turned toward me. "Mrs. Lawson," he said carefully, "would you like to respond?" I looked across the table slowly. At Vanessa, who had called me temporary. At Graham, who was already redesigning my kitchen in his mind. At people who spent 12 years pretending tolerance was love. Then I reached into my bag and said 4 words that changed everything. "I'd like to play something." The room shifted immediately. Evelyn connected my phone to the speaker system without a word. Vanessa frowned, glancing at her attorney. "What exactly is this?" I looked directly at her. "The truth." Then I pressed play. Static first, then breathing, then a room coming into focus. And then Vanessa's own voice, calm and clear, filled every corner of that conference room. "Once Daniel's gone, the house situation becomes significantly easier." Every single person at that table went completely still. Graham's face lost color so fast it was physically visible. The recording continued without mercy. "She won't know how to fight this legally." Elise laughing softly in the background. "Especially once she's properly isolated." The mediator's expression began hardening. Their attorney sat up slowly from his comfortable lean. 2 people on the Lawson side exchanged a glance that said everything. Then came the line that shattered the entire room. Vanessa's voice, calm as a business meeting. Daniel never needed to know how any of this was structured. Silence descended like something physical, not ordinary silence. The kind that happens when a room full of people simultaneously realizes they are hearing something that was never meant to exist, evidence of something that was supposed to disappear with the people who planned it. Graham recovered first and made the most predictable mistake possible. "This is completely taken out of context," he said loudly. Evelyn slid transcripts across the table without looking up. "There are 10 complete minutes of context available," she replied evenly. The recording kept going. Detailed discussion of liquidation timelines, property value projections, specific pressure tactics designed to accelerate my surrender, and then the line that made the mediator actually stop writing. Graham's voice, utterly confident. "Once she's emotionally exhausted enough, she'll sign anything we put in front of her." This was a private family conversation. Vanessa's voice cracked for the first time all day. The composure she had maintained for months broke open in one sentence. I looked at her across the table. "You planned this while my husband was still receiving treatment." That landed harder than anything said in that room all day. Because it was simply, completely, undeniably true. "You manipulated that recording," she said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "No," Evelyn replied, without any heat in her voice at all. "But your family certainly manipulated a grieving widow." The mediator removed his glasses and set them deliberately on the table. "I need to ask directly. Were legal strategies regarding removal of Mrs. Lawson discussed prior to Daniel Lawson's death?" Silence. Nobody answered. Which was the only answer that mattered. Then Graham panicked, and in panicking, he destroyed everything they had left. "You don't understand how much money is actually involved here," he said, loudly, to a room full of witnesses. The silence that followed was catastrophic. Even their own attorney closed his eyes briefly. Because in 5 words, Graham had just told everyone exactly what this had always been about. Not legacy. Not family. Not protecting Daniel's memory. Money. That was all it had ever been. Vanessa turned toward him with a look that could have melted concrete. "Stop talking." Too late. The mediator leaned back slowly in his chair. "I have serious and significant concerns regarding the credibility and intent behind this filing." Their attorney requested an emergency recess within 60 seconds. But the damage was permanent. You could physically feel the room change sides. Not sympathy toward me. Disgust, clean, cold disgust, directed at them. Vanessa tried one final time before leaving. She walked past me, leaned down slightly, and whispered, "You've destroyed this family." And for the first time in 12 years, I felt absolutely nothing when I heard that. Because families are not destroyed by truth. They are destroyed by the behavior that truth exposes. The lawsuit collapsed within 2 weeks. No dramatic apology, no accountability, no acknowledgement. Just quiet legal withdrawal paperwork and sudden silence from people who had spent months acting completely untouchable. The social rumors reversed almost immediately once mediation details circulated privately. Funny how quickly people rediscover their moral clarity once power shifts visibly. Friends who had vanished began reaching out again. I ignored most of them. Because betrayal teaches you something important about absence. Once you understand why someone disappeared, their return tells you just as much about them. The house stayed mine. Legally, fully, permanently. But more than legally, emotionally. For the first time since Daniel died, it felt like my home again, instead of contested territory I was temporarily defending. I renovated the upstairs study several months later, not because the Lawsons had planned to, because I wanted to. I turned it into a reading room with warm lighting and the floor-to-ceiling shelves Daniel always talked about building someday when things settled down. One evening during renovation, clearing old desk drawers, I found a sealed envelope tucked behind a stack of financial folders. My name in Daniel's handwriting. I sat down on the floor and opened it slowly. Rebecca, if you're reading this, I probably ran out of time to say certain things properly. First, the house is entirely yours, completely and legally. I made certain of it. Second, I need you to know something I should have defended far more clearly while I was still alive. You spent years trying to earn acceptance from people who were never worthy of the effort you gave them. But you made this house a home long before I truly understood what home meant. Don't let anyone take that from you. I love you. Daniel. I cried harder reading that letter than I did during any moment of the mediation. Because grief changes shape when validation finally arrives too late to share. But strangely, it also brought something I hadn't felt in over a year. Peace. Not because the pain disappeared, because the fear finally did. And there is a difference between those two things that matters enormously. A house becomes a home when fear finally stops living inside it. These days the rooms feel lighter. Not because everything is fine. Grief doesn't work that way. Daniel is still gone, and some mornings that truth is as heavy as it ever was. But I stopped asking people to love me, who were only ever interested in what they could eventually take. And that freedom changed me more profoundly than winning any legal case ever could. If someone has ever tried to take advantage of your grief, your kindness, or the quiet dignity of your silence, then you already understand how deeply betrayal cuts when it comes disguised as family. You are not alone in that. Drop your story in the comments, because someone else out there may desperately need to read that other people survived this too. Subscribe if you believe truth matters more than reputation. And if this story reached you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been carrying too much weight for too long without anyone noticing how hard they've been holding on. Like this video, so the algorithm puts it in front of someone who needs to hear that staying silent is not the same as being safe. And if you've ever had to walk away from people who only valued what they could eventually take from you, I would genuinely love to hear your story. Thank you for being here.